butter blue milk here. You know, it's not bad. It's very tropical. I don't know if that's on brand for Tatooine, but you know, when you're out there in the desert, I guess you need a little slice of paradise. So what's Star Wars about? Now that's a pretty big question. You know, you got at this point, I don't know how many thousands of issues of comic books and novels, of video games, TV episodes, and of course the movies. It's really all too broad to just distill into a single sentence. But I suppose if I was asked to really sum up why it resonates, I'd say that I think Star Wars has always on some level been about the existential peril that's just below the surface of every democracy. And I think that's an important distinction because a lot of times Star Wars kind of gets lumped in with all that Joseph Campbell hero's journey stuff, but it's not like Star Wars was written in the time of the Sumerians, you know what I mean? That Star Wars is clearly a product of the kind of post-World War II, post-imperial global order of nation states. You know, the kind of golden age of liberal democracy in the Western mold that seems to be in danger of slipping away a little more every day. You see, the old mythologies were never concerned with these, like, self-reflexive questions of the self and the state. God, or something like it, gives Gilgamesh or King Arthur and his round table a certain moral clarity. As long as the hero acts virtuously, they're on the story's good side, and what's virtuous is never all that difficult to parse. Threats and temptations are external. The world has a fundamental order to it that's not really in question. There are mountains for the hero to climb, and monsters to be slain, and rewards to reap. But Star Wars is actually a little different in that regard. Lucas, coming up, was an academic. He was studying cultural anthropology, and he had the same distrust of authority that you'd expect from any college kid of his era. I mean, he came up in the 60s in NorCal. He was a hippie. So even though Star Wars, by the standards of 1977, was deeply traditional, I mean, the Wagnerian score, the kind of silver screen, corny earnestness, all of which, you know, set it apart sharply from what New Hollywood was really keyed into at that time. But it was also a total subversion of what all that old stuff it was building on had been about.
Last card. Didn't think you'd get away with this, did you, Ming?
First point. For one thing, there is no God in Star Wars. There's no deity granting moral authority to the king or to his knights. So therefore, there's no moral authority to pass down to the defenders of the kingdom. And sure enough, the kingdom in Star Wars is deeply immoral. Enough so that the whole plot is about taking the kingdom down and replacing it with something better. Because there is no God, there's only the Force.
I'm one with the Force, and the Force is with me.
And the Force itself grants no special moral authority to our heroes. When they begin to unlock its power, they're manipulating it to ends which may be good, or may be ill. There are no holy justifications to be found in the Force, only opportunities for self-reflection and greater wisdom.
Adventure. Excitement. A Jedi craves not these things.
The highest virtue a Jedi can aspire to is acceptance, which has an inherent pacifist bent.
I will not fight you, Father.
And of course, there's a dilemma there that ought to be immediately apparent. This is Star Wars we're talking about. The Jedi, however pacifist they may claim to be, are pitched as this class of warrior monks. They're identified by the special weapons they wear at their hilt.
This weapon is your life.
Violence isn't just to be expected, it's promised, right there on the marquee. There can never be lasting peace in the galaxy far, far away so long as there's an audience that wants to see some stuff get blown up. And if the model Jedi is someone who's just gonna roll over and accept the violence of their oppressors, they're not gonna be much of a force for good. And yet we're shown time and time again through the trials of the Skywalker bloodline across generations that answering the call is just going to lead our heroes down a messy road to probable self-destruction and maybe even genocide. Now, it's not much of a stretch to transplant that moral dilemma onto 20th and 21st century America. Right? The original trilogy was conceived of with Vietnam not all that far in the rearview mirror. And it had been a pet consideration of Lucas's for a while. In fact, before Star Wars, Lucas had spent 4 years developing Apocalypse Now with John Milius. And the whole idea of the low-tech Ewoks giving the Empire this humiliating defeat in Return of the Jedi was just his way of working that Vietnam dynamic back into Star Wars.
The good guys are the rebels. They're using asymmetric warfare against a highly organized empire. I think we call those guys terrorists today. We call them Mujahideen, we call them Al-Qaeda.
When I did it, they were Viet Cong.
Beyond Vietnam, the bigger picture of the Cold War and into this century with the kind of forever wars of Iraq and Afghanistan, the America that anointed itself the ultimate defenders of justice and freedom after World War II has seen that self-image tested over and over again as our military campaigns have predictably devolved into ethical quagmires.
I have brought peace, freedom, justice, and security to my new empire.
Your new empire?
But again, unlike Lancelot, America isn't led by some divinity, no matter how much some people here would like to think we are. The citizens of a modern democratic state can't just pass the buck to some higher authority. So long as America remains a functioning democracy, its citizens ultimately own its sins. And you'll notice, despite Star Wars' penchant for old world terminology, talking about princesses, knights, and whatnot, political tradition in its world, very pointedly, is one of representative democracy. And when that democracy elects to lapse into a fascist dictatorship, that is the aberration. But it's not one that comes from outside. They're not conquered.
So this is how liberty dies. With thunderous applause.
I am always thinking of new dreams.
ジョージ・ルーカス
I dream of visions which have
彼は
yet to be seen,
いつも新しい夢を考えてきた
which have not yet been
見たこと
heard.
のないものを
From dreams,
聞いたことのない
create
音
a
を
new reality.
現実の形にしてきた
In this universe, new dreams and new friends.
この宇宙は新しい夢と仲間でいっぱいだ
Panasonic, always new dreams, wonderful friends.
パナソニックいつも新しい夢素晴らしい仲間
All right, drink number 2. Coming at you from the swamps of Dagobah. It's very rich. Okay, so it's 1999. Phantom Menace comes out.
Thumbs way down.
You didn't like it?
No, I think I deserve a public apology from George Lucas.
Fans have spent 2 decades building their own perfect backstories in their heads. And when they finally get to see the Jedi Order in action, they seemed a little off to some people. I mean, The Jedi in the original trilogy had been like this loose band of warriors existing outside the state, kind of like the Ronin in feudal Japan. But we'd only seen Obi-Wan and Yoda in a period of exile after the rise of the Empire, which had hunted their kind, and a lot of people had just sort of inferred, based on what they'd already seen, that the Jedi had kind of always operated on the fringes of society, almost on principle. But The Phantom Menace redefined what the Jedi Order had been just before its fall. We saw that the Jedi were once this vital organ, really, of the state, making literal Obi-Wan's line in A New Hope that the
Jedi Knights were the guardians of peace and justice in the Old Republic.
Now, pointedly, the Republic, as we're introduced to it in The Phantom Menace, has no standing army. Member systems at this time were expected to defend themselves however they saw fit. And for at least the last 1,000 years, the Jedi had served as this kind of nominally independent diplomatic/paramilitary subcontractor to the state.
You must realize there aren't enough Jedi to protect the Republic. We're keepers of the peace, not soldiers.
The Phantom Menace introduces this idea of the Jedi as distinct from, yet intermingled with the state, which is one of a handful of instances in that movie of a recurring motif of symbiotic relationships.
You and the Naboo form a symbiont circle. What happens to one of you will affect the other. You must understand this.
So just as how it introduces the concept of midi-chlorians, these microorganisms with all biological life in the galaxy, and which serve as like intermediaries to the Force, the Jedi saw themselves kind of as like the midi-chlorians to the Galactic Senate's leadership. And in this way, the Order, under Master Yoda, rationalizes its totally unspiritual duties as armed ambassadors advancing the political agenda of the Chancellor. Not too surprisingly, perhaps, the moral dangers of this arrangement become only ever more clear as the Jedi begin to paint themselves further and further into a corner.
Magnificent, aren't they?
So Yoda and Mace Windu grumble about Palpatine extending his stay in office past normal term limits, and yet they continue to do the Chancellor's bidding, despite having no legal obligation to do so. Again, the Jedi Order is, at least in theory, wholly independent, and yet it's been a part of this weird marriage of mutual benefit with the powers that be for so long, and the Jedi have grown too cozy with this union. They occupy a literal tower of figurative ivory in the expensive surface level of Coruscant, just blocks away from the Senate. And on a planet that's mostly dense, Blade Runner-y urban jungle with a lot of destitution, that's primo Manhattan real estate for some monks who are supposedly ascetic. Now, we only get hints of this in the prequel movies, but in the Clone Wars TV series set between episodes 2 and 3, it really hits hard how the creeping fascism that's eating away at the Republic becomes harder and harder to ignore. By the series' end, roughly a few months before Revenge of the Sith, you got like anti-war protesters on the steps of the Jedi Temple calling them out. And there's a nice visual irony in seeing so much of Yoda and Obi-Wan and Anakin working alongside guys like Tarkin already in his full Nazi-esque naval uniform.
The Chancellor feels very strongly that the Jedi be removed from as many military matters as possible. You yourselves said that you're peacekeepers.
Or flanked by, clone troopers, which are basically just stormtroopers, right? And of course, it makes logical sense that a lot of the iconic Imperial sort of villainous design language would have its roots in the Republic that preceded it, but when you get to see that evolution on screen, it really helps sell the idea that the Empire didn't come out of nowhere, that the seeds of the Republic's downfall came from within. It's my favorite kind of visual storytelling and visual world building. But anyway, so the Yoda of this period is a man before his fall, right? And, late in Revenge of the Sith, Palpatine's Jedi extermination campaign has begun in full, and the temple's burning at the hands of both Yoda's fallen pupil, Anakin, and that same Chancellor that Yoda didn't stand up to for a decade, despite one blaring authoritarian red flag after another. And Yoda finally makes a last stand against this newly minted Emperor, now unmasked as the titular Phantom Menace of yore. And this leads to maybe my favorite image in the entire prequel art. The cavernous hall of the Galactic Senate, now devoid of all the members of Congress who are supposed to fill it. And there are only these two strange fucking cartoon wizards from rival clans battling it out in the bottom of the frame while the fate of trillions of lives hang in the balance. Palpatine has finally successfully strangled democracy, and shamefully, a sectarian blood feud has risen to take its place. And of course, we know that Yoda loses that match and he barely escapes into self-imposed exile. Yoda co-signed the Clone Wars out of some misguided sense of obligation to a corrupt regime, and in doing so, his moral equivocation helped pave the way for the Empire. But the story's still sympathetic to him.
Into exile, I must go.
I mean, he pays his penance. Because when we're reunited with Yoda in The Empire Strikes Back more than 20 years later, he's a changed man. He's spent 2 decades in isolation among the swamps of Dagobah, only talking to, I guess, the disembodied voice of Liam Neeson and occasionally force timing some kid named Ezra. And yet, for all of his isolation, cut off from the rest of the galaxy, here's a Yoda who can finally laugh.
Take it to him, Ariel.
He's shed the trappings of his ivory tower life, and now he lives contentedly, humbled in a mud hut eating stew. And when Luke, not much younger than his dad had been at the time of his fall, tracks down the old Jedi Master, Yoda at first refuses to teach him.
Much anger in him. Like his father.
Just as he first refused to teach Anakin, who turned out to be such an instrument of destruction. But Yoda reluctantly gives in to Obi-Wan's dogged pursuit of their half-baked plan from a generation earlier. And you could argue that this is Yoda once again compromising against his better judgment, but the circumstances are different this time. Yoda knows he's on death's door. He can't fight any more battles against the Sith, and the other Jedi are long dead. He can't control things. He has to pass the torch on to the next generation. And many years later, in The Last Jedi, Ghost Yoda's words to Luke, now in the twilight of his own life, speak to a greater embrace of this humbled spirit.
The greatest teacher, failure is.
No doubt reflecting upon his own historic failures. One of the ways in which that movie interrogates the legacy of the prequels and how they recontextualize the original trilogy in a way that I think works really well. Yoda points to that next generation, the brats who are bedeviling Luke like Rey and Kylo, and he says,
"We are what they grow beyond. That is the true burden of all masters." And
this is Yoda's final lesson. For what good is it to overthrow the Empire? What good is it to restore freedom if the heroic savior can never relinquish control of the narrative? The true spirit of the Jedi and of democracy has got to involve the peaceful transition of power. Yoda's fall, his period of reflection and humbling, his redemption, becoming a better teacher than he ever was at the height of his institutional power, is a case study in how the world we live in is shaped by our own interior spiritual health. A republic can't thrive if the body politic is sick, because the people we need most to stand up to oppression ain't going to be up to the task alone. This one comes with some marshmallows. Toothpick.
The Olympics consist of testing one's potential.
オリンピックは自分の可能性に挑戦することと、可能性の限界に達したとき、人は最も美しいフォルムになるだろう。
To create images
映像はいつも可能性への挑戦だ。
Digital magic.
Panasonic.
We're lost. My fault, but you... Oh! Neither! Food? Yes, crunchy food. C-3POs.
New Kellogg's C-3POs. Twin rings phase together for a crunchy new force at breakfast.
Yeah, the force is with us.
A delicious part of this nutritious breakfast.
All right, third beverage of the evening. This is a dark-sided drink for sure. Oh, whoa. Okay. Speaking of. All right, let's do this. Segue. So my generation, you know, we came of age politically in the aftermath of 9/11. You know, you had the Patriot Act, 2 wars. We graduated into the worst economy since the Great Depression. And we found ourselves at odds with the olds on some deeply divisive matters of social justice, you might say. I mean, the majority of us, and I can't say all of us, but more of us than not, I think got that the fight for things like gay marriage, you know, it wasn't just about a victory for one group, but it was a victory for everyone. And in the best years of the Obama administration, it felt like the fearful small-mindedness that had sometimes made America seem a step behind our allies was gonna die out at long last. There was a sense of inevitable, slow but steady progress, at least to me. And looking back, I'm sure that contributed to my perception when The Force Awakens came out in 2015, that there was something hollow in its Rebels versus Empire rematch. See, what that movie introduced us to the First Order. A loosely sketched depiction of an ultra-militant spin-off of the fallen Galactic Empire. You know, and they've spent 30 years licking their wounds and low-key plotting a swift, decisive attack on the New Republic while a quiet Cold War has been reaching a boil. Now, Disney-era Lucasfilm had decided to eject the old expanded universes version of what had happened after the original trilogy, and decided to replace it with a timeline in which the Empire basically gets a mulligan to do bad all over again. And this felt like a cheat to me at first. Because especially after the lukewarm reception of the prequels,
I think I deserve a public apology from George Lucas.
It was always going to be their safe bet to bring back the familiar iconography of the Empire for a simple, straightforward, good versus evil storyline without all the complicated parliamentary shenanigans of the prequels.
Will you defer your motion to allow a commission to explore the validity of your accusations?
Which would have been the case if the new movies had found Leia being, let's say, like a chancellor of the universe, so with the old rebels on top for a change. But with the invention of the First Order, J.J. Abrams could just jump right back into the gee-whiz action quotient. Now, Abrams has said that the First Order was inspired by wondering where all the Imperial brass ran off to after the Empire's demise, kind of like the Nazis who fled to Argentina after the Second World War had done. Of course, the Nazis who fled to Argentina never built a resurgent war machine in Antarctica or dropped a nuclear warhead on Washington, D.C. while launching a full-scale Red Dawn-style surprise invasion, which is basically what happens in The Force Awakens. It's a bit far-fetched, and one could argue it all reads a little close to hitting a big red reset button. And yet, looking back at it from the perspective of the rest of the decade that was to follow, kind of think Abrams had it right. And that's because newborn democracies, such as the New Republic, have a tendency to backslide into chaos. And this is hardly rare, and it's something that we're seeing, unfortunately, all too much of around the globe these days. After the first few decades of my life, where it felt like global democracy and human rights protections were like some inevitable end state of history that we were just walking up to, we're watching over the last 5 years or so authoritarianism, strike back.
Coming to your galaxy this summer.
And even as The Force Awakens was being conceived of in the first part of the decade, the ascendant far right in Europe was gaining traction thanks to a crippling economy and racist fears of mostly Muslim immigrants. Even in America, the election of a black president with a foreign-sounding name sent certain quarters of the country into apoplectic shock. A movement of anti-government, nativist, conspiracy peddlers known as the Tea Party swept the Senate and pushed out many longtime establishment Republicans. Gone was any hope of bipartisan compromise, and the Democrats, who had been prone to infighting and an entire generation of mush-mouthed, focus-grouped centrism, proved totally unfit to serve as a check on any of this. You see around the globe, from Poland to Turkey to Russia to, yes, even America, major nations of the world have had their rule of law eroded as their leadership grows increasingly unaccountable to the international community. And no one seems equipped to do a damn thing about it. You hear a lot about the hashtag resistance on Twitter, but the literal resistance of the sequel era Star Wars movies actually got there first by about 6 months. You know, you've got the children of the New Republic, like Poe, Rose, and eventually Rey and Finn, demonstrating this pluralistic idealism, this belief in the basic goodness of people and the mandate of their fledgling democratic state, while General Hux and Kylo Ren, on the other hand, demonstrate the surprisingly pervasive appeal of reactionary hate to offspring who are looking to reclaim the glories of their past ancestors.
Show me, grandfather, and I will finish what you started.
Now, if you're just going by the movies, there's a lot of context and backstory left out that I think is really interesting, and I think it's a missed opportunity. In Claudia Gray's novel Bloodline, we really get a good sense of how the politics of the New Republic after the Empire were at least as contentious as our own. Most of the senators in the New Republic fell along two factions, the populists on the one hand and the centrists on the other. Now, the core worlds, including the former capital, Coruscant, are the heart of the New Republic's techno-capitalist economy, just as they had been during the Empire and even stretching back into the Old Republic. And the core worlds had it pretty good during the Empire. True, they recognized Palpatine's brutal crackdowns, and in the years after the Empire, Darth Vader had basically become a childhood boogeyman, but a lot of them admired what had been the efficiency of the Imperial machine. The Imperial machine, it was a military-industrial complex that had only come to exist in the waning years of the Old Republic, thanks to our boy Palpatine. And truth be told, it was a great economic program, if you happened to live on the right planet. I mean, the Empire's ecological devastation and violence had always been exported to the Mid-Rim or the Outer Rim worlds.
Your Empire needs you! Troopers forward!
Places that in a lot of cases had been the Republic's most persistent opposition during the Clone Wars. And those planets, farthest from the bright center of the universe, as Luke once put it, they never really enjoyed useful representation in the Republic. So it was an easy sell for them to align themselves with the Confederacy of Independent Systems during the Clone Wars. But when the Republic was reconstituted into Palpatine's Empire, those systems suffered the most under its boot. And because the Outer Worlds had suffered so much more under the Empire, their constituents tended to want a new Republic that looked as little like the Empire as possible. This is how you get the populists. Their emphasis was on limited galactic government in favor of greater planetary autonomy. They wanted to dismantle the military-industrial complex that had basically dominated the agenda and the budget for the past 60 years, and restore a true peacetime government, the likes of which hadn't been seen since then. And arguably the most famous populist after the New Republic's first chancellor, Mon Mothma, was, you know her, you love her, Alderaanian survivor and rebel hero Princess Leia Organa. Now, unlike Mothma, who championed disarmament, Leia was something of a hawk, and it's not too surprising. I mean, she was known for doing war. She was good at it, having been on the battlefield ever since she was a teenager, and she was deeply, deeply troubled by the continued existence of an Imperial remnant and its reconstitution into the First Order. She was as good on the Senate soapbox as she was with a pistol, at least until about 5 years before the events of The Force Awakens, when the centrists leaked that her biological father was none other than that intergalactic symbol of mass genocide Darth Vader, and that she'd been hiding this fact from everyone for decades. It's tough to come back from that one. You can imagine the attack ads. Well, with her political capital vanished and her faith in the dysfunctional Senate tapped out, she quit. She returned to what she was best at, getting people to blow stuff up.
Permission to jump in her next wing and blow something up?
Permission granted.
And she became the brains behind an unofficially sanctioned, off-the-books resistance to counter the rising threat of the fascist First Order. So, could the New Republic have ever lived up to its promise, or was it doomed from the start? Well, there were a few problems with trying to restore the Republic as it had once been. For one thing, the Republic of old may not have had a standing army, but it did have those Jedi to help keep the peace. And without an army of spiritual super soldiers on retainer, well, the New Republic was always in a precarious position, both with the internal squabbling of any new state and with the lingering threat of its own extremists pushed out of the spotlight. Forgotten, but not gone. Just licking their wounds. You see, the profiteers of the Empire's appetite for violence didn't disappear overnight, just because the Republic signed an armistice. A criminal underworld had also thrived under the Empire, as Palpatine recognized the need to keep those Outer Rim worlds like Tatooine under control. The Hutts made out well during that time, as did other criminal syndicates like Black Sun and Crimson Dawn. But a mob boss can neither afford nor staff outrageous baubles like city-sized flagships and moon-sized battle stations. So from the very beginning of the New Republic, there were perverse incentives among the tycoon class to keep the fire of the Empire burning in some form, which we get a taste of in The Last Jedi.
This guy was an arms dealer. Made his bank selling weapons to the bad guys. Oh. I'm the good.
The First Order, it doesn't spring up overnight from some distant, unknown pocket of the galaxy, even if it amassed its fleet in secret. Its financial backing and cultural support is rooted inside the New Republic, in the centrist worlds that never quite wanted to give up on the old glory of the Empire. I mean, even if it's no longer deemed PC to fly those banners or to put Grandpa's old trooper helmet out on display, the core worlds resented the suppression of their past, which further fomented a romantic, nostalgic yearning for the old days. And it contributed to the New Republic's willingness to let its guard down in the face of an imminent threat in the form of the First Order. The desire to proactively create a more egalitarian world results in an opposite force, a regressive and maladaptive frustration with a changing cultural zeitgeist. And this war machine that had been built up for so many decades, with money to burn and future fortunes to be made, recognizes this frustration and is able to seize upon it.
The potential of your bloodline. A new Vader.
Now, that brings us to the flip side of that new generation. The kids of the Resistance. They're motivated in the face of overwhelming odds by legends of bygone heroes and promises of a more fair tomorrow. They wear their idealism on their sleeves. They're space millennials, which explains why so many dudes on the internet hate them. But when we someday get stories about Rey and Finn and the rest of the Resistance in some sort of post-First Order world, I hope that Star Wars has the courage to engage seriously with the questions of what it means to lead responsibly, to hold the power of governance without becoming the very thing one fought to overcome. Because that feels very much in keeping with the legacy of the series as a whole.
This holiday is yours, but we all share with you the hope
Cheers.
that this day brings us closer to freedom and to harmony and to peace. No matter how different we appear, we're all the same in our struggle against the powers of evil and darkness. I hope that this day will always be a day of joy in which we can reconfirm our dedication and our courage, and more than anything else, our love for one another. This is the promise of the Tree of Life.